Okay, welcome everybody. I hope most of us that are going to be attending are all logged in. Just so that you're aware, you can talk to us via the chat, and there will be an opportunity for Q&A later on. And my name's Kim Roberts. I'm General Manager of Arts Industry Council, and I'm going to hand over to Ruth Weldon, our co-chair, who's going to be facilitating the session today.
Thank you, Kim, and welcome everybody. We're so pleased you could join us at such short notice for this important start of this discussion. I would also like to, before we go any further, acknowledge that we all live and work on Aboriginal lands, and we pay respects to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people joining us today. Always was, always will be. So the point of today is to have our initial discussions around the new cultural policy, the arts and cultural policy that was released on Monday, A Place to Create. That is a 10-year policy that was also accompanied by a 2-year delivery plan. That was released to us by the newly named Create SA, formerly Arts South Australia, after a long process of consultation and development. Certainly, I know we in the industry have been waiting for this document for quite a while. And today will be the first of potentially a few sessions and the start of lots of discussions. How it's going to work, we've got a few of our wonderful Arts Industry Council committee members who are going to take some time to speak to the policy from their perspectives. We have Dr. Tully Barnett, who is Associate Professor of Creative Industries at Flinders University, and she comes to it from a wealth of knowledge around policy and the arts industries. We will then jump over to Rebecca Young, who is the Chief Executive of Access to Arts, who will give her thoughts from the disability arts perspective. And then we're going to jump over to Julian Hobber, who is the Executive Director at State Theatre Company South Australia, and who can talk to the policy from a theatre and from a theatre perspective and from a statutory authority as well. To give you a few updates from where we are at after Monday, Arts Industry Council have reached out to the Minister's Office. We're aware there was a bit of there's a bit of clarification needed around the funding that's been allocated, and some clarity about where that money is going and where it's coming from, if that is funding that was already assigned or if that's new money. So we have reached out to the Minister's Office and we are waiting for a reply on that, and we will present that to the membership as and when that comes through. And also something that's been on our mind is the Arts Task Force that happened last year, and the findings from that and the recommendations that was made by the task force, where we're definitely on to the Minister and Create South Australia about what is happening with those recommendations, and we will continue to advocate for that information to feed into the work that they do and to be made public. So those are two of our big agenda items coming out of the policy announcement on Monday. And also just to address that, on Monday, they released the policy document, the accompanying planning, a delivery plan. And there was also the announcement of the legislation that is currently in draft form and is up for feedback, which is really promising. And certainly that's something that we at Arts Industry Council will provide some feedback to and look into in further detail. So I might just jump in and get started. And firstly, I will hand over to Dr. Tully Barnett for her perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth, and thanks also, Kim, for organising this for us. I like my acknowledgements that we meet on the lands of the Kaurna people. I'm on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I add my pay my respects to elders past and present. And I wanted to think about some of the aspects of this policy, you know, from that kind of academic perspective. So a bit of that is about providing context. So, you know, just reminding us all, we all live and breathe, many of us live and breathe this stuff. I've got my highlighters out with lots of different kind of color codings for my thematic analysis of these documents. And as Ruth said, we're really looking at those 3 documents, that policy document, A Place to Create, that's a 10-year vision, you know, and then the delivery plan that's a 2-year practical guide, as well as that draft bill that is asking for feedback I think that's open for a little while for feedback. And so everybody should be thinking about how to respond to those questions that we're asked to respond to for that draft bill as well. So I'm just going to do a little bit of, you know, policy history, not a lot, but drawing your attention to the previous policy, which was really called a arts and culture plan that was released in 2019 under the Marshall government. And as is the way of policy documents, some of those links to find the actual document are no longer active. One day, and I say this a lot, but one day I will write my paper that's called Australian Cultural Policy 404 Not Found. But to let you know that there is a great website called APO, the Analysis and Policy Observatory, that collects policy documents. And so that gives us this sense of policy memory that I think is really important to have when we're looking at a new policy document. So you can go and find the arts plan there if you're interested to think about that history. But as far as, you know, I couldn't find any other formal cultural policy document that has been released by the state government of South Australia. You know, of course, you know, thinking back to the big changes that have happened over time, one of the things that this policy does is change the name of Arts South Australia to Create SA. And so, you know, I think we can look back a little bit to when Arts SA was launched in, I think it was 1996, and think about the work that has done over time as something that we can be thinking about in terms of any questions that we might be formulating around what the change might mean for the arts and culture sector. And I think really it is too soon to really know that. You know, I'm an academic, so I'm going to speak really, really frankly about some things. At first thought, the term Create SA makes me wonder where artists are in that vision. But then in the document and in some of the speeches that we heard on Monday morning in the launch, you know, Peter Malinauskas and Andrew Michaels both said things like making South Australia the place to create, and that does put artists back at the centre of that policy. So that's some really, really important things. But I also wanted to acknowledge that arts and cultural policies don't exist in a vacuum. So, you know, here in South Australia, we've got relevance to that national body. So Revive, the national cultural policy by the Australian Council for the Arts, now Creative Australia, was launched in January 2022 and has been ticking off a lot of its big ticket items despite some of the difficulties and controversies that Creative Australia is involved in right at the moment. There's a lot of policy action that has happened in that space. A lot of those things, you know, the next thing on the list is Writing Australia that is about to start. In the middle of this year, it's legislated. And I would recommend anybody interested could go and listen to some of the words that Tony Burke said this morning on Radio National in the Arts in 30 segment program. There were a lot of really interesting questions that were posed to Minister Burke there and some interesting illuminating answers as well. But in addition to that federal landscape, it's also important to think about the local government landscape. And so City of Adelaide has a process as a policy in draft at the moment after a long consultation period, and that will be launched soon. But all of our other local government and councils have many of them have draft cultural policies or processes, consultation processes. For example, the City of Sydney the City of Salisbury currently has an open call right now for its arts culture development plan. But all of our councils have relevant culture policy documents, or at least statements and departments that's worth thinking about how these things fit together with this policy document, but also that we've got the South Australian Arts and Cultural Tourism Strategy, which is called 2025. It was released in 2021. So we need to be thinking about these policy documents in collaboration with each other. So then just maybe thinking for a couple of seconds about some top level kind of responses that I've got. I mean, I'm hoping that we'll really use this session to get insights from the people in the room, the people in the sector who are having, perhaps nascent thoughts about, about how they're thinking about this policy. And so we can take some of these thoughts that you're developing to create essay for insight. And if that's useful to you, we want to know. We'll be putting in a response. AICSA will be putting in a response, and we kind of want to know what you think as well. So I think it's worth pointing out that we've got this 10-year vision document, and there are different views about why a 10-year vision. But I think this is evidence that the government has and AICSA has listened to the sector in wanting something that goes beyond an electoral cycle to do something slightly longer term. And I also think that by accompanying that vision, that 10-year vision, with a 2-year delivery plan, it does the best of both worlds by having the big thinking and then by having actionable things that it can actually address within an electoral cycle or term. So I think that is really commendable. I think a lot of the particular things in both the policy and the delivery plan show that that listening has been done to the sector, that those consultations that we went to were not in vain, and that people were listening, and that a lot of that work is evident here in the policy document that we received. I would point out the fact that the delivery plan contains a lot of imprecise, hopeful language that is a bit more policy rather than practical based. It does talk about, considering and thinking about things and exploring things rather than saying this is what we are going to do. But I still think that the things that are encoded inside of that considering and exploring language are things that the sector has asked for. I mean, I think I'll leave it there, but I hope that we get a chance to talk more, as the webinar progresses.
Thank you, Tully. Really appreciate your perspective and giving us a bit of an overview on policy as well. And just to jump in, perhaps I should have outlined in more detail in my introduction at the end of the presenters having their moments to speak, we will open up the chat where we'll open up to questions to the presenters, to Arts Industry Council, and also for any general comments of discussion that you'd like to raise. We have also been asked, we Create SA are happy to take questions on notice. So if there are any questions that you would like for us to take to Create SA, we encourage you to add that to the chat discussion. And even if you think of something in the coming days, drop us an email. We're going to collate a series of questions to present to them from the membership and industry. And we're also planning to do another webinar where we discuss those questions and respond to them, potentially with someone from Create SA in the room, or potentially from written responses. So we are really keen to get your questions for them as well. I will jump now and introduce Rebecca Young, who is the Chief Executive of Access to Arts, to present her perspective. Thanks, Beck.
Amazing. Thanks, Ruth. Also coming to you from fabulous Ghana country, and would love to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'm going to get a little bit more specific deep dive, but really appreciate, Tully, that was such a great broad introduction to the landscape that we find ourselves in. First of all, I would like to say that it is really fantastic to see access and inclusion mentioned throughout both the policy document and throughout the delivery plan. It is mentioned in a lot of places, but once again is somewhat lighter than we'd like it to be potentially on specifics. But, you know, the preamble goes through things like saying that, you know, a highlight is increased commitment to ensuring access and inclusion and equity. And ambition is that our arts, culture and creative industries are accessible, equitable and inclusive. That South Australia is a place where excellent and diverse art and culture are made. So they're broad strategies, but they're definitely things that we have been really looking to see articulated throughout government plans. So it's really great that there is that focus. I'm going to run through a few things that are in the delivery plan just to kind of give our initial thoughts and feelings. But we really want to see some, I suppose, very interested to see what specific actions come out of a lot of this kind of exploring and developing and commencing. So really strategy 1 about arts, culture and creativity for everyone. When you hit 1.3, it's very much talks about access and inclusion for young people, and then for deaf and disabled communities, marginalised and disadvantaged communities. So if we look at that, it would be, I suppose, we'd love to see disabled artists sort of given their own focus outside of, I suppose, other marginalised communities, given that we are talking about a group that is potentially 20% of our population. But we would really looking forward to seeing what the new initiatives and partnerships are around arts in health, because that's an area that's really dropped off over the last few years. But I have I suppose a big sort of orange light over the commencement of the development of a set of equity plans that will sit alongside this. And I think the feeling across arts and disability is probably going to be the feeling that was across arts and disability when Revive came out and said, oh, and we're going to have a separate plan. So there's definitely two sides to that. One side is it's great to have a separate plan because it does give it that focus aside from other communities. But does that mean we wait another 2 years for any action, tangible action in that space? So I know Arts SA or Creative SA have been speaking to us for a while about some of the reviewing that they're planning to do. But I'd be really keen to see those equity plans happen post haste so that we are keeping up with the other work that's happening inside this. I'm also not really aware of any specific money that's been benchmarked for any of the arts and disability activities. So we shall see what comes from that. If we move on to strategy 2, and looking at things for artists and arts workers, you know, anything that improves the lives of our broader artists and art workers community will improve the working conditions of our disabled artists and arts workers. But if we move on to 2.4.2 in the delivery plan, it does talk specifically about working alongside disability arts organisations to support deaf and disabled artists and creatives to prioritise access and inclusion, but also to transition to new national disability funding models. Now, I think the terminology around that will be interesting to unpick because they're likely talking about NDIS, and there is a big problem with NDIS in arts and disability that it doesn't necessarily identify arts work as a real job. And art as a real job. So there's definitely some work to be done there. But also it's not necessarily a funding model that can replace arts funding at all. It's definitely about those individualised supports. But we're also keen to see what happens with the new foundational supports model and whether there might be some work in that to support the community, particularly around things like audience access. Strategy 3, we were really excited to see when we were sort of going through the plan how much accessible is put into many of these different initiatives around cultural institutions. So happy to see that they're talking about building diverse audiences, because we'd love to see some support for audience development across disability. Also, we've been doing lots of advocacy for infrastructure accessibility with improvements. So hoping that the exploration of options for the new shared office facilities for state theatre, state opera and country arts have a strong focus in ensuring that there's accessibility back of house for artists and arts workers, because we know that those organisations find that a big barrier, and we really want to support the advocacy to make sure that any infrastructure that is included in these plans really is included in a way that everyone can access them. So the accessibility is really, really key. And just really thrilled to see where they're talking about working across agencies when they talk about things like working with the autism strategy and other things like that. I'm really hoping that we can ensure that our disabled artists are supported across all of the different agencies that they interact with. A couple of things we'd really like to see coming out of this are continued investment and commitment to the Richard Llewellyn Grants Program, which is an absolute national flagship when it comes to disability arts. Making sure that there's some funding for better artist supports and more accessible practices, such as grant processes, a focus on improving accessibility across mainstream arts, and more focus on ensuring that any infrastructure improvements have lots of accessibility built in, including not just letting the architects tell us what accessible looks like. So that's a quick summary for me, and but I'm really looking forward to getting into some big conversations with some of my colleagues across arts and disability, and really working out what everyone's questions are.
Great, thank you, Beck. Really appreciate that perspective. And I will now hand over to Gillian Hobber, who is Executive Director at State Theatre Company of South Australia. Thanks, Gillian.
Thanks, Ruth. I'll just say I'm perched right above Lion Arts Factory, who are currently in the middle of a sound check. So if there's a bit of percussion, that's what it is. I'm just going to speak briefly to our response as a kind of a statutory authority, and I guess a broader kind of arts organisation lens on it. It's reassuring. I'd agree with Tully's earlier comments about how welcome it is to have a strategy, and how the strategy does show evidence of good consultation with the sector. I think it's tried in a general sense to capture a lot of things, and that perhaps comes through in some of the delivery plan language, which is a little more aspirational perhaps than concrete. The third strategy, what's called strategy 3 at the start of the document, speaks to robust arts organisations, creative businesses and cultural institutions, which I think is a kind of fundamental aspiration. I suppose what I perceive in the policy is that a lot of that support is intended to come through new grant opportunities, whether it's through, in the delivery plan, they speak to reviewing the grants programs to ensure they align with a place to create. So exactly what that review of grants programs produces will determine a lot of where any new opportunity is for either large or small organisations. And a lot of that, in that sense, I think the policy raises a few more questions that it answers about where that funding is going to be directed. I suppose what I think the policy doesn't acknowledge is the backlog of need in the arts organisations, and the the unstable base that currently exists that could undermine our ability to access those new opportunities. So whether that's the kind of key small to medium arts organisations or whether it's the statutory authorities, there's been a pause effectively on indexation to funding to these organisations since about 2016, 2017. So the base has been eroding within arts organisations over that period of time, and you can see that in some of the stuff that happened around the museum recently, last year. And so I don't think the government's unaware of that. I think they've established a policy within which they would hope to address it, but I don't think that the policy really answers a question about how to rebuild organisations that have been affected by a combination of stagnant funding and coincident rapid escalation in prices from COVID, and the cost of operation across that time, the same time, has gone rapidly up. The funding stayed the same. So it's great to see a few more opportunities in there for competitive project-based work. But whether that delivers the robust arts organisations and infrastructure that we need, I think, is an open question. That was the main thing I was going to say about that.
Thank you, Gillian. Appreciate your perspective. Appreciate everybody's perspective. Thank you all for jumping in. I think now let's open up. Let's have a bit of general discussion with everyone who's in the Zoom room. And yeah, if there's any questions you want to flag to the Industry Council generally or to any of the presenters. And also just there has been a few people who have added comments and questions to the chat, but just, yeah, if there is anything you'd like us to take to Create SA when we present them with questions, please do add it to that. Kim, you can open up the chat. Fabulous.
Yes, so I've just opened up the chat so that everybody can see comments. So you've got the option either to just send to everyone or to hosts and panelists. So yeah, feel free to post comments or questions in the chat. A previous one that was sent directly to hosts and panelists was about the lack of reference to dance in the document, apart from, you know, there's some beautiful photos, but not specifically mentioned. And I think that sentiment also extends to other art forms too, that there's not much specific mention of individual art forms in this document, which is, and in the strategy, with a couple of exceptions. So I think that that's definitely something that we'd like to get more clarity on, and how some of these strategies directly relate to different art forms. And that's something to put on my hat as an independent artist. I would also like a little more clarity around some of this. It's fantastic to see an entire strategy that is around thriving artists and creatives. But yeah, as far as how that's going to work logistically for artists, we'll have to wait and see how that rolls out. One thing I wanted to flag from a music perspective as a musician is I did notice that it was good to see a statement to increase funding for South Australian contemporary music. And in the media release, it also directly linked this to existing programs through the Music Development Office. So I would like to see, I guess, whether that's an increase into the project support grant pool, which artists will have access to, or whether it's a continuation of things like the See It Live vouchers to go through venues. So it's fantastic to see it there, because that pool hasn't moved for a long time. But yeah, once again, just awaiting a bit more clarity. So that's just my very quick 2 cents from a perspective of a musician. But yes, thank you for the comment about dance. That was noted too.
And can I just refer to the second part of Kathy's comment, which refers to the lack of reference to all the documentation and reviews reports that have been done over years to the for the dance community, including one quite recent one, which goes back to Ruth's earlier comment about any lack of explicit reference to the Artists at Work task force, which hasn't yet been released. We understand that it's planned to be released, but the fact that it's not visible in this document, that the dance review is not visible in this document, leads me to have some questions about, I guess, the broader consultation space, the broader knowledge gathering space that underpins the things that have been flagged here in this policy, and then again, then what's missing, whose voices are missing from that process, and what happens when we contribute to these processes in good faith for them not to be explicitly referenced in a policy document like this.
One thing I was going to mention that I didn't was we mentioned briefly when we caught up the other day, there's not a lot of reference to infrastructure in the document. The Marshall government plan had identified the need for more, especially rehearsal spaces for theatre making in particular, but dance and other forms as well. I'm not sure if that's been deliberately avoided because it's not considered within the scope of the policy, but I think it's something for us to take up with Create SA for our subsequent meeting as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good
The,
point.
the need certainly hasn't gone away and isn't going to, so.
No. There's been a few Ross, sorry, perhaps people don't want me to mention names. I guess we can all see the chat. There's a quick query here about how do we harness, synergize between federal, state and local government cultural strategies? How do we play to the intersections that do exist? Which is a very interesting question. Yes.
Well, Tully, you can take this afterwards. I mean, to some extent, I think they have aligned it to a cultural, to the federal government cultural strategy to revive in some senses, and even some of the initiatives like the Arts Investment Fund speaks to this general tendency that governments are getting into of kind of, yeah, like it's project funding for the aspirational project rather than kind of underlying grant increases. And I guess there's pros and cons, but it does suggest that they're looking for an industry that's going to collaborate and come together more around large scale projects. That doesn't kind of address workforce capability and all of those kinds of things. And I'd just note, to Ross's point, the City of Adelaide is currently in, I think, a policy formulation stage, and have an intention to produce a cultural policy sometime soon, but I'm not sure what that will contain.
Yeah, I think it's you know, being presented as kind of as we speak, so we should be watching out for that. You know, how do you harness those synergies? It's such a tricky question, really. You know, you can see elements of this policy that would be more easy to harness those synergies, and that would be the nods that are in there to arts for health and well-being outcomes and for community engagement stuff. There are quite a few comments about that in throughout the policy, and those are the things that may travel further to those local government cultural policies. It would be great to see other, you know, explicit strategies to enable those synergies to emerge, and to make sure that we're not existing in these policy silos, which it can be part of the problem with using these to gain momentum, because, you know, we'll have these, you know, electoral cycles, a federal government election in a few weeks, a state one in a year. Sometimes it's those harnessing the synergies at the intersections that transcend what could be policy memory problems across changes of government. So I would, yeah, I'll think about that and see what I can come up with.
But I think it's a good point to how to add, you know, it's flagged right up front in the policy that this is intended to be a whole of government plan, and the question for us is really, how do we make that an actuality, not an aspiration?
Just some clarification from the chat as well. City of Adelaide's draft cultural policy is going to council next Thursday with the intent to consult with community on the draft policy following this. So we can expect to hear something soon.
Great, thank you, Kim. And we've got a few more questions popping into the chat here. We've got here, forgive me if this is a stupid question, no such thing as stupid questions. I'm new to this space, but with 1.3.3, exploring opportunities to increase access to arts, cultural and creative experiences for marginalised and disadvantaged communities and audiences, is there a consistent definition of those audiences? Are there particular stats, proxy measures that they use for tracking these? I think that's a really good question for us to note to when we go to create essay, but I don't know if anyone in the panel has any thoughts on that. Perhaps Beck, you have some thoughts on that?
I'm happy to jump in. We did a little bit of work with AICSA, Create Essay, on some of the language when they were putting together some of these documents, and something we did call out around those is that that language is not very explicit and could mean many, many things. So there is an inconsistency between the Word document and the published document in one of those, because they did actually pull out deaf and disabled artists. But yeah, I think there is not a particularly consistent definition of what marginalised and disadvantaged communities are, and it would be really nice to see that considered in a more explicit way.
Great, thank you. I think that's definitely an important one to speak to them again about and get more clarification. A few other points here. Will strategy 2.5, and strategy 2.5 is facilitate opportunities for South Australian artists and creatives to develop markets. Will strategy 2.5 see a serious engagement with the whole of government, and what could this entail regarding the development of markets, trade, networks, etc.? No other government department or folio is identified in the delivery plan. Again, a good one for us to take to create essay, but if any of the panelists has any thoughts on that, I think that's a good one for notice for sure. Then we've got Melinda from Fabric. Thanks for joining us. While there is reference to regional culture, there is no mention of support for regional galleries for either programming or infrastructure support. I'm concerned that this part of the art sector remains invisible. Very good point. Certainly one that we can definitely take to create essay. And, you know, there's certainly a few things around infrastructure that haven't been addressed in this policy, both regionally and within the city. And yeah, I think that's a really, really valuable bit of feedback and a question that we can forward on.
Just quickly, Ruth, to jump back to the question regarding 2.5, there is a little preamble in the delivery plan that gives a broad brushstroke of how a whole heap of different government departments are interacting with the plan. So it is worth going back to have a read through of that, because while they may not be specifically in the actions, there is I suppose, a statement of intent from a range of other government departments as to how they will interact with the delivery plan. So definitely worth a read.
Thank you, Beck. That's a good point. And I think it's in the policy document as well, potentially. Yeah, amazing. More points here within the chat. Would like to see advocacy around artist employment, Often programs, initiatives, policies say artists will be given a platform, exposure, and an opportunity. What artists need above these things is employment. If employment exists, those things like platforms, exposure will follow, not the other way around. Generally, if an artist is given platforms, exposure, and opportunity, it means employment is not guaranteed. And that's a very valid point. And I think that also feeds into the fact that some of the findings from the Arts Worker Task Force have not been released and don't necessarily seem to feed into this policy document. I don't know if anyone would like to speak to this to add their perspective, but I think definitely we will be advocating for that when we have these conversations with Create SA.
Well,
yeah, you go ahead.
Well, only to say that I hate to, I don't want to appear to be pushing an organisational barrow, but a lot of employment of artists takes place within the funded organisations. And if the organisations aren't funded to employ people, then that's a lot of that. That's not to suggest there aren't, there needs to be a lot of independent projects and opportunities funded, but it needs to be recognised how much, especially in South Australia, artists are employed often through the organisational ecosystem.
And to echo some of the sentiment from independent artists, I would agree in that we need to be looking with a bit more depth at paying conditions for artists and things like minimum fees or rates for artists that aren't just suggested but that are mandated, to ensure that independent artists are remunerated properly for their work and that they have appropriate conditions. And there is a note in here about partnering with Creative Australia's creative workplaces. But I would like to see some more concrete information around this. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. Another point also under 2.4, 2.4.6, supporting artists and creative businesses to build capacity, including through programs and services of the Office for Small and Family Business. And I think it's interesting looking at the approach of an artist as an independent artist as a small business, while in some cases, it is the case to the extent that you are operating as a business, but also if you can do all of the capacity building in the world and all the training in budgeting and spreadsheets, but if the pay isn't appropriate, then how is that going to be viable and sustainable over the long term? So they're just a couple of things that I'd like to see fleshed out in a little bit more detail. So yeah, thank you for the comment in the chat, and we'll definitely be adding that to our list.
This might be an example of some of that less precise language. 2.3.2 is supporting career-aligned development pathways and opportunities for established artists and creatives. And so there's some, there's that, what does that mean? How do, there's there's a little bit of lack of detail there that I hope gets fleshed out quite soon.
And funnily enough, Tully, a question around that 2.3.2 has just popped up here in the chat. All the panelists have noticed ambitious or imprecise language. With my next question in that spirit, with 2.3.2 supporting career-aligned development pathways and opportunities to establish artists and creatives, is there a clear or pre-existing understanding of what that means? Or is this something that panelists expect to be articulated more clearly in the execution? And that's a really valid point. I don't think that there is a clear definition of what that means or a clear understanding. And I think that's absolutely something we need to add to our discussion with Create SA. Certainly within this chat and within the discussions we had on Monday, it definitely feels like there's a lot of detail that is perhaps missing with some of these things. There needs to be a bit more clarity. And I think this is a really great example of that. Some of those definitions are not there. What else have we got here? We've got a few more things that have coming through. Matthew from Unley and Creative Communities Network, local government will be requesting a meeting with Create SA to look for the synergies and partnerships Tully mentioned and a general broader community engagement with the arts. There are loose references to placemaking, public art and creative hubs, but there's so much more. That's really great. That's wonderful, Matthew, that you're already wanting to have that discussion with Create SA and connect and have that synergy. What else have we got here? Again, from Matthew, what interest does Arts Industry Council have? Oh, sorry. Yeah. In the Act of Parliament, local government certainly will to leverage action and budgets in councils. So yeah, that's an interesting thing as well. And the draft act is up at the moment, I believe, the legislation. So it'd be worth everybody having a look at that. Tully, have you got some comments on that?
Oh, just to say that the consultation closes on Sunday, the 27th of April. So that's not a lot of time to formulate. So, I think anything that the sector might need in support for thinking that through, you can get in touch with the Arts Industry Council or with me personally, just to, even have a chat. Sometimes, you just need that kind of structure before you, go for a response to something like that. I would say similarly that it's quite light on. It says it is an act to recognise the importance of the arts, culture and creative industries in South Australia, to provide for a state arts, culture and creative industries policy, to ensure that all South Australians benefit from and can participate in arts, culture and creativity of South Australia for other purposes. And previously, we at the Arts Industry Council asked some questions around what that might mean in practice, thinking that it would be great to see something tangible as a result of that. For example, an annual speech to Parliament, or an annual, day of something in Parliament, to really acknowledge this, and so perhaps, yeah, asking for some tangible specificity to be embedded in that could be a useful thing. But it does say something about the role of cultural policy. So it might mean that there are more policy, processes going forward, which can be an opportunity for the sector to come together to ask for a thing, and also to watch, to examine the outcomes of that policy process, to keep an eye on whether particular parts of the policy have been achieved or even attempted to be achieved. So that's a good thing in that draft legislation. And I think that speaks to some things in the policy that are good language, such as referring to Mondial Cult 2022, which calls for an understanding of arts and culture as a global public good. And so that this policy is playing, its part in that call to action is definitely a positive thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, that and good to encourage people to put their feedback in, to check out the legislation, because it's not a lot of time for feedback. Certainly Arts Industry Council will put our feedback in for that as well. And another comment here around established artists are usually identified as having had practice for at least 5 years. So where then is the support for emerging artists? That's a really good point, actually. I don't know if there was any or very little mention of emerging artists within the policy or the delivery plan. There are some notes around the grants, and potentially that could feed into that with the with Create SA grants program. But yeah, I don't think there was explicitly much mention of emerging artists in this document, in either documents.
I got a little something to say about that too, sorry. In that section we were just looking at, which I just can't currently quite see, we talked about it being, established artists get that, career aligned pathways. 2 items above that was emerging artists. What they get is professional development. And so there's a mismatch there for me. That's a mismatch that we probably need to call out, that, that has ramifications for how these policies will get put into practice. And I think that's not fair if the emerging artists get some professional development, but the established artists get career aligned, blah. That's not the right order of operations.
Yeah, absolutely. and yeah, well, you know, the vagueness of professional development and what is that and what does that mean and where's that coming from? Yeah. Interesting. Great, lovely, wonderful points to take on with our further discussions. Further comments here, I think this is probably something we've moved on from, but is anyone still advocating for AICSA/Create SA to be its own department again? I'm not sure. I think that's not something that's sort of on our radar at Arts Industry Council, but we can certainly take that to note and discuss that within the committee. I don't know if any of the panelists have any thoughts on that. But yes, we will note that. That's not something that's on our agenda, I don't believe. Julian, did you have something to add?
I was just going to say, I think, you know, it's the question of what shape Create SA has and what its defined functions are is an important thing. It's unlikely, I would say, to become another department, but when you look at the aspiration of the policy versus the current staffing of Create SA, you have to ask where the work on all of these delivery plans is going to come from.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Further comments here. In the policy development discussions, there was a sense that there would be new money secured to deliver this vision and plan, or was it rather that pre-existing funds would be realigned to these strategies, i.e. is the cake getting bigger, or are we just slicing it differently, or is that something we can ask directly in the next stages? That's definitely something that we have asked our fellow co-chair, Emma Webb, who unfortunately can't be with us today, did reach out to the Minister's office and has directly asked for clarification around the funding and what's pre-existing and what's new. And we are hopeful to get some feedback on that shortly and disperse that through to the membership and the wider industry. And it's certainly something that we can discuss in the next stages as well. Tully, you've jumped off. You want to add to this conversation?
I was just going to say that the announcement is definitely that there is some new money. So that's definitely what's been announced. What's unclear is exactly how the numbers add up and how they're sliced across years. And so that's what we want to get some clarity on before we come out with a statement. You know, either way, there are questions being asked about some of how that money is being dispersed. And one question I have is, you know, one thing that's been announced is $1 million for grants, for arts grants through Create SA, and whether that is the only peer-reviewed as a form of the money, and how much of the rest of it is. And I know Jared Thomas has got some questions about how much of the funding is going to First Nations artists. And so there are some further follow-up questions to have that hopefully we'll be able to give you a better answer about in the future.
Yes, absolutely. Watch this space. We're pretty much hit right on 5 o'clock. Obviously, we did start a bit late, so if there are any last questions or comments from everyone attending or from the panel, I would, please speak now. We will take everything from the chat. We will note it all, and we will take what is relevant to Create SA. I think most of it is. I think these are obviously questions we've discussed within this chat, but there are some bigger questions here that need some clarity and further information. And as I said, our intention is to do another webinar when we have these answers and these responses. We have reached out to Create SA, and we would like for a representative to attend. Obviously, that might be schedule dependent, so we'll certainly keep you all posted. But certainly we will present the responses either way. And we will also work on our written response to a place to create from Arts Industry Council, from the committee and the membership. And hopefully we get some responses soon from the minister's team around the spending and the budget. And we'll keep advocating for the task force and their findings as well. So unless there's anything else that might be it, or oh, thank you. There's been a lovely comment here. Thank you for this fantastically useful session. Appreciate the time and generosity of all the panelists and other participants in working together on this and sharing views openly. Thank you, Vanessa. That's very kind. We appreciate you all being here and appreciate all the panelists and all your time. And if something drops into your head later, please drop us an email. Kim will respond. info@artsindustrycouncil.com.au. I'm guessing off the top of my head. It's on the website.
info@AICSA.net.au, and yeah, I'll respond. So if there was anything you felt too shy to say today, or you wanted to remain anonymous as well, it's perfectly fine. Please feel free to send it through and I'll collate it in with our response.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everybody, and watch this space. If you're not already signed up, please sign up to our emails, to our e-news, and we will have more news as it comes in, and we'll let you know as soon as possible about the next webinar. And if there's any non-members attending, please think about joining the membership. And we work really hard to advocate for the industry, and this is a crucial time. So we appreciate all of your support. Thanks, everybody.